Okay, guys, we're getting ready to talk about your formative assessment assignment. Like we said, this week we are going to be looking at creating some formative assessments, and that is going to pair really well with the reading that you're doing in Chapter 5 in the textbook. One of the great things I love about this textbook, and the reason it's so widely used as a textbook in mathematics methods courses, whether at the graduate or undergraduate level, is just the level of activities and instructions that are there in the text to help you. It's one of the textbooks that I would strongly encourage you, if you purchased, never to sell it back. It's just a huge wealth of information. And you'll start to see that as you get deeper and deeper into the actual chapters on the basic operations and concepts that we're learning. But just starting out here in Chapter 5 with formative assessment, okay? So what is formative assessment and why is it important? When we are starting out in education, we typically think of three types of assessment. We think of pre-assessment, which is obviously important because unless we know where the students already are, we're probably not going to be very effective in teaching them. If we haven't done solid pre-assessment, then we may be starting out far beyond the student's level of comprehension, or even worse, in some ways, boring them to death with content they've already mastered. So good solid pre-assessment is always where our brains start thinking. Now, if you want to get a little bit nitpicky about that, most educators would consider pre-assessment part of formative assessment, but I like to talk about them separately, usually because if we're writing up or planning a formal lesson plan or a formal observation, you're going to want to address all three types of assessments separately. Pre-assessment, of course, we would think of as being before the lesson. And formative assessment, which is what we're going to talk about today, during the lesson. And summative assessment would occur at the end of a lesson or at the end of a unit or at the end of some sort of large instructional block in which you're going to make a final evaluation of that student's performance. So why is formative assessment so important? Okay, I found this graphic, and I think it's a really good graphic to kind of bring this idea home for us about why assessment's really important. It's the bridge between teaching and learning. There's no teacher who is so perfect that we can instantly look at a student and know if they have absorbed what we've said. I tell students all of the time when I'm explaining something, especially when I'm working with a face-to-face class, if I've given them instructions and I still see this little bit of a confused look on their face, I will look at them and I will say, look, that makes sense inside my head, but it's up to you to help communicate with me and let me know if it makes sense outside of my head. Now, that's a reasonable expectation of adult learners. And even at probably the high school level, we can expect them to be part of this job to communicate and formatively assess what's going on there. But especially with younger children, that's something that we have to teach them how to communicate about. And we also have to have a regular pattern and regular expectations in place of ourselves to do that. Okay, so why is that so important? And this first sentence here is kind of what it's all about. It's not about what we're teaching, it's about what they are learning. I have met with educators before when I am assessing them in the classroom or when I'm working with them as student teachers. And I ask them, how do you know your students know this? You know, if you're teaching a lesson on fractions, how do you know that they know how to add fractions? Or why should they know how to add fractions? What is your evidence for that? And I will have many educators look at me and say, well, I taught it. You know, I showed them how, I told them what to do. Yes, you may have, and you may have done one heck of a job doing that, but that is not evidence that they learned it. We all know that we can have something in our mind that we're trying to say, whether it's to a student or to a loved one or a family member. We can have the most clear expectation ever of what we think we're saying, and that can be misinterpreted. That happens a lot more with young students and students who are maybe not at the content level in which we would think, because we're communicating from an area of knowledge. Okay. We know what we're trying to say. So when we hear our words, to us, it makes perfect sense. Whereas as a student is not coming from that area of knowledge, they're coming from it a novice point of view. So we have to have this constant communication going back and forth between us and the students to know not only what we're teaching, but what they're learning. If you ever find yourself looking at a summative assessment, maybe a unit test or some sort of MAP assessment you've given your student, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm just really shocked by this result. I did not expect them to bomb it. That's the time where you have to start asking yourself, what am I teaching versus what are they learning? Okay. And that's where a formative assessment comes into play, because we can't think about that after we've given the summative assessment, because at that point, in a lot of ways, we've moved on. We've moved on to a new unit, or we've moved on to a new term. And yes, while we always have to keep reteaching, that opportunity to reteach within the lesson is never going to be as good as it was while we were originally teaching that content. So formative assessment helps us to keep from missing that opportunity. Okay. They do that because they help us determine what's being learned while the learning process is happening. Okay. So really, when we start thinking about formative assessments, I think of them as sort of three different categories. Okay. Temperature of the room. Basically, to me, that means what are they doing as a whole? And then I'm going to be doing some individual checks in the middle of the lesson. And then I'm going to do some individual checks at the end of the lesson. Okay. Now, yes, that means you're doing a lot of footwork. Okay. You're checking with individual students. You're offering remediation for individual students. One of the results of these formative assessments is for information for those who are providing RTI for students or giving them additional help outside of their normal classroom, maybe in a resource classroom. If they don't have the information from these formative assessments to know what your students are struggling with, that's going to limit what they're able to do with them and the progress that they're going to make. Okay, so let's take each one of these three kinds and kind of break them down. If I'm talking about the temperature of the room, what does that mean? I have seen plenty of teachers just teaching their heart out in front of a classroom and look out into the classroom, and they are oblivious to the fact that they have a classroom full of students who have all checked out for whatever reason. It could be because the material is so far advanced for them that they've given up hope of understanding it and they've moved on to just causing a problem. That could be part of it. It also could be that, this is too simple for them and they have decided that they're bored into tears. There's a lot of reasons for that. So you have to, as an educator, always be aware of the temperature of your room. Okay. So what does that mean? Are your students comfortable? Are they confused? Are they bored? Are they engaged? Are they just paying attention? Okay. Are they just pretending to be busy? One of the most common things you'll hear me say if you ever take another education class with me is that engaged and occupied are not the same things. And it's up to professional educators to know the difference. Okay. So that's all part of the temperature of the room, what's going on. Okay. So how do you check that? That's part of formative assessment. Obviously, monitoring student responses is one way to do that. So if, as you're teaching the lesson, you're walking around the room, you can be looking down at examples you've worked with them or things you've asked them to respond to, or just asking them to share those with you. Okay, depending on how much comfort the students have in that classroom may limit the responses that you get, though. Okay, thumbs up, thumbs down. This is a lot of formative assessment I see, especially in very early elementary classrooms. Of course, thumbs up means I'm understanding. Thumbs down, I'm confused by what you just said. Again, this needs to go on while the lesson is happening, okay, not at the end. Because as we introduce new ideas, if we see there's confusion, it's much easier to stop and remedy that at that point than it is to go 20 miles down the road and then have to back up and try to resolve that problem. Think, pair, share. You can have them as you introduce new concepts. Stop and talk about those with the neighbor. Okay. Think about what's being said. Talk about that with a neighbor. Ask a question, maybe. Those are all things you can build in. As you hear the responses to that, that's going to give you an idea of the temperature of the room. Okay. I've also seen some elementary teachers use popsicle sticks at certain points of the class while they're doing transitions or whatnot. They will have students either hold up a popsicle stick or put it in a container somewhere on their desk that indicates they feel comfortable, they're very confused, they just have one question, they're lost, something like that, some sort of representation. So there's a lot of different ways just to check the temperature of the room. So this is not an individual thing. This is a thing that lets you know how are your students doing as a whole, okay? Obviously, if everyone is confused, you probably want to go back and look either at what you've said or at what kind of a pre-assessment that you're basing this off of. Somewhere along the way, you've jumped the track, okay, if you see that. So once we kind of get an idea that the temperature of the room is okay, as a whole, it doesn't look like there's any major implications, we move on and we start checking individuals, okay? So doing this in the middle of a lesson is sometimes a little bit of a challenge because we don't want to break our instructional flow. We all know as educators, you have a classroom of 20 or 30 students and you've got that time where they're all actually working. We don't want to break that concentration and try to do a transition. So in math class, one of the things I've found that has been really great for formative assessment is using whiteboards, dry erase boards. If you cannot purchase those, your school doesn't want to purchase those, it's always really simple just to get a couple of packages of sheet protectors and throw a white sheet of paper in there. You can write on those as easily as you can. Of course, they don't hold up the way a whiteboard would do, but they will work in a pinch. Okay. Partner quizzes, having them quiz their partner and discuss things with their partner. There's also a tactic called 3 times summarization, where you can ask students to write small summaries based on a number of words. Obviously, that's going to work best with older elementary students because with kindergartners, you're going to spend more time trying to get the writing in place. But that still can be done. It's just going to have to be done on a smaller scale. After all, we do want to encourage communication about math. Making sense of math through contextual situations and through conceptual understanding is the single most important thing that we can teach in elementary math. Okay, so that's what we're going to use in the middle of the lesson. Again, I'm not saying that these are the only 3 options. Of course, your textbook may offer you some additional types of assessment, and there are plenty of teacher websites out there where you can look for additional kinds of assessment. Okay, so moving on. If we get to the end of the lesson, this is what most of us think of when we think of a formative assessment, those exit slips that we use at the end of a lesson. Excuse me. Exit slips are perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with using them. But what are you going to do with them? If you're simply having the students complete an exit slip and then you're just throwing it away, or you're giving it a check or an X and then giving it back to them, you're really not exactly using this as a formative assessment, okay? If you're grading it for a grade, first of all, then you're making it a summative assessment. And that is going to encourage your students to have a lot more anxiety, and it's probably going to limit their willingness to engage, okay? So an exit slip for me, I've always tried to use it to do something purposeful with it. And one of the most purposeful things I've ever found is to use it in some way to do an activity I call my favorite no. I like to use it at the beginning of the class. Usually I try to refer to exit slips from the previous day, or maybe it was a bell ringer problem from the previous day that I think everyone struggled with and I want to address again in some fashion. Basically, this is how it works, okay? You're going to have your students take their responses, put those on either an index card or a half sheet of paper, something that they're going to turn into you. You are going to sort those responses into yes and no. Yes, of course, would be correct and incorrect. And I would strongly suggest that you use good educational common sense when you're doing this. Don't make a big deal out of that in front of the students. The goal is not to embarrass those people who have gotten it incorrect. Usually what I'm looking for when I'm looking for a my favorite no is somebody who has exhibited a misconception that I think a large number of the class is probably going to have. For high schoolers, the biggest example I can think of is in using order of operations when they believe that multiplication represented by parentheses is the same thing as grouping symbols and do it first. For example, if I had 4 parentheses 3, they would complete that before an exponent because it's parentheses. It's not really. We know that's multiplication, but students have been had that drummed in their head. So some sort of misconception that you think a lot of students might express in your class. I'm going to find that and I'm going to call this my favorite no. What I'm going to do is show that to the class and allow the class to discuss it. Now, this is a really good opportunity. You're either going to create a very negative tone in your classroom by doing this, or you can take a chance to create a very positive classroom culture where mistakes are valued. Okay, now what do I mean by that? Whenever I'm going to create a my favorite no, I usually recopy it in my own handwriting. What's the purpose of that? No one's ever going to be able to pick out the student who created that. I also have pre-prepared questions to talk about. And, one of the things I ask is not just what did the student do wrong? Obviously, it's not correct. That's why it's a no. Okay. Not just what did they do wrong. But a lot of the conversation we have is what were they thinking when they did this? Why do you think that this is a mistake that someone would reasonably make? Okay. And by having conversations like this, we take that mistake making from being this horrible thing that everybody wants to avoid. And we make it something that everybody's going to do at some point or another. It's nothing to be ashamed of, and it's something that we can always grow from. And by sharing our mistakes with others, we're helping them to not make those mistakes. And we're also learning how to not make those mistakes ourselves. Okay, so there's a little video here. You're welcome to visit that site if you like. Watch the video of the teacher who uses my favorite no. This teachingchannel.org, you may have to create an account there if you don't have one already. It's a pretty quick process. It's free, and you get some nice, professionally interesting videos from time to time there. Okay, so what is your assignment? After you work through chapter 5 and you're reading this week and you kind of walk through this process, you're going to create 3 formative assessments of your own. And in order to do that, you're going to use the instructions that are on this page and the rubric for that. So we'll start off here by looking at the instructions. Okay, so these are our assessments, which again, we use formative assessments because they let us fix misconceptions in learning during the lesson and help every student get the help they need, clarify those misconceptions before we get to a summative evaluation. All right, so what are we going to do? When it comes down to creating your 3 different types, you are going to have to create 3 different types. Okay, so what does that mean? You can't have 3 different exit slips. You're going to have to create 3 individual types of formative assessments. So that might be, excuse me, a think, pair, share. It might be 1 exit slip. It might be something else, okay? So you're going to choose 3 different types. And then for each one of these types, you are going to tell me what kind of a formative assessment, what type is it, what learning target you're hoping to assess by this. Remember, everything we teach, every objective we teach, we have a learning target for that. Okay, what are your students trying to do? I can add 2-digit numbers. Okay, whatever your target is, that needs to be there. Now, you also want to identify what level of Bloom's taxonomy is being addressed here. Okay, now if you have not seen or heard of or know anything about Bloom's taxonomy, I have posted in this module a revised list of the action verbs. Okay, so these are things we're asking students to do. These are really the verbs that should be used every time you write a learning target. Okay, why? Because these are things that we can evaluate. We can actually look at and have concrete evidence of and we're clear in what we mean of what we're asked students to do. Okay, for example, I would never set up a learning target as I can understand numbers. Okay, understand is not a valid verb that we would want to use here, because what are we expecting to see? Okay, it has to be something clearly defined that we can evaluate. Okay, so here are some of these Bloom's verbs. Now, what we want to get at here is that these verbs, as you see them classified, we are classifying them sort of by their level of knowledge, okay? Which means if I'm asking students to do some of these things, I'm really hitting that low level knowledge of just remembering, okay? So basic recall. If I'm asking them to choose or define or label or list, match, name, all of those things are pulling from that low level just remembering, okay? Now, it's not to say that that's not a necessary skill, especially when we're learning things like new math vocabulary. It's absolutely necessary. But at some point, we do want to start transitioning our students into this higher level thinking, okay? Not just regurgitating, but evaluating, okay? Where they are assessing something. Let them read a response and evaluate it and give feedback to a person. Let them compare, let them criticize. These are things that have moved on past just recall into that evaluation. Okay, so once you've given your learning target for your assessment, your formative assessment, then you're going to tell me, based on this goal that you've written, what kind of knowledge here, what level of Bloom's taxonomy are you assessing through your task? Okay, so when it asks you for that level of taxonomy, what you're looking for is up here. Which one of these levels are you hitting based on the verb you used in your target? All right, now once you've done that, you are going to tell me the Kentucky academic standard that you have addressed with this assessment. So what standard did this target come from? Folks, please make sure that you are using the Kentucky Revised Academic Standards for Math. There is a link to that page directly at the very first module in your course that says, I think, Getting Started, because a lot of you are trying to use Common Core math standards. And Kentucky now has revised academic math standards. They actually revised them and put them into practice last academic year. So 1920 was the first year they were there. Please make sure you're pulling your math standards from there. As a teacher, you are legally responsible for teaching the proper standards. So if you're not pulling from the right standards and you're in a classroom, that's going to be a problem for you. Okay, so please make sure that you're aware of that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, send me an email and I will help you work through that. Okay, so this is sort of like just the info about your formative assessment. Then you're going to give me a copy. This is what you're going to create. What would you give to the student taking this assessment? So what are you going to ask them to do? For elementary students, this really shouldn't be a huge involved task. Remember, it's a quick assessment. If it takes them 30 minutes to do, you really can't give it to them in the middle of a class, nor at the end. So be conscious about that. What would you give to the student? You also need to give me some sort of a mini rubric or a checklist you would use to evaluate the student's response. At a minimum, this rubric must clarify what you are looking for to indicate mastery of this goal. Okay, so you need to be able to look at that exit slip and tell me, what are you looking for? Okay, if you were giving this to your student, what would you need to see in order to believe they don't need any additional reteaching? Okay, what would you need to see? And if you're not going to see that, then you might have, almost there, or you need to attend a reteaching session, however you want to word that. But there needs to be something on there as a minimum that tells me, what are you looking for to indicate mastery? Okay, so there is an example. I've given you an example here, and the example I've given you is language arts, so nobody can use it. Of course, all of yours have to be math targets, but this is a key details exit. The learning target here is I can identify characters in a story using key details. Because they've used the verb identify, we see that that is from level 1, excuse me, which is from the remembering level. That comes from the Bloom's taxonomy sheet that we just looked at, okay? If we were to scroll down this list, okay, if we were to think about identify, we are just finding, we're just locating, okay? So that's going to be in that remembering level of knowledge. And here is a copy of what we would give to the students. The directions: after reading Martina and the Beautiful Cockroach, identify the characters of the story by listing them below and list one detail about each of the characters you have listed. Submit your work in the exit slip basket. Okay. So down here you see there is a rubric of how this is going to be scored and what the student needs to do to see that. Okay. So that's telling them how it's going to be scored. Down here is that part which is even more important: level of expected performance. So what this teacher is saying is that when she gives this exit slips to the students and she scores it, if they don't get at least a 3, she knows they have not mastered this target and they need some additional work. Okay, so all of that needs to be there. You need to communicate to me, what are you looking at? Now, I don't mind at all if you find these on other websites. However, you must, absolutely must, cite your source. That is the only thing I ask. If you got it from a website, you need to say in here, I found this example or I found this assessment on blah, 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 whatever website you took it from. If I were to find your work or your submission on a different website, and a lot of the ones I do look and check, then that would count as an honor code violation. Remember, we all talked about what does it mean to be academically dishonest. So you do have to take a few extra minutes and make sure you cite any source that you pulled something from. If it does not say otherwise, I will assume that you are presenting this to me as something you created all on your own. So please be sure that you are presenting me the truth if that is the case. All right, so that's what you're looking at. If you have any additional questions for me about formative assessment, okay, first of all, I would recommend that you do read your chapter 5. And then after you've looked at that, you're welcome to email me and we can have a further conversation.